Hello everyone, it's Miss Katie, and I'm here today to read to you the story What a Truly Cool World by Julius Lester and Joe Cepeda. And I don't have the book, but I found it online, so I'm going to read it out loud to you. What a truly cool world. Here we go. When God finished making the world, he felt as bright and as sunny as love. He had never made a world before, and if he said so himself, and he did, he thought he did a very good job. God looked around at the round ball of green and blue and brown suspended in the darkness of space. The green, trees, the blue was water, and the brown was land, and people were down there too. Black, white, yellow, and red, and animals horned and clawed and winged and furry. God smiled and decided to go home and get ready for bed. Just then, Shaniqua, the angel in charge of everybody's business, came bursting through the door of the throne room. God, what do you call that down there? She wanted to know, pointing out of the window. That's the earth. Pretty, ain't it? Shaniqua looked at God like he was blind in one eye and deaf in the other. Don't look much to me. I don't want to hurt your feelings or nothing like that, but what you made looks kind of boring. God narrowed his eyes and stared at the world again. You right, Shaniqua, he admitted reluctantly. I know I'm right. I am always right, she said. The next morning, God woke up early, ready to do some more creating, but he didn't know what. When he walked into the throne room, the Hallelujah angelic choir of 6 trillion voices started chanting like it had done every morning for the past 11 trillion years. God, God, he's our man. If he can't do it, no one can. That's true, God thought. I am the man. Bruce, he called out. Bruce was God's secretary. He was standing in the corner, brushing his wings. Yo, what's up, deity? He asked, hurrying over to God. Bring me a pair of scissors. Bruce had no idea what scissors were since they hadn't been invented yet. He flew off to the library of everything that is going to be and typed in scissors on the computer. The next thing you knew, he was holding 2 long, sharp pieces of metal joined in the middle. Awesome, Bruce proclaimed. He flew back to the throne room. Here you go, mighty one. God leaned out of the window, his arms stretching out till he reached earth, and he began clipping the trees. Tiny green pieces of leaves floated down to the ground, and that's how grasses and bushes came to be. That's better, God declared. Now the world isn't so brown. That ought to satisfy Shaniqua. God wasn't finished being pleased with himself before Shaniqua charged into the throne room. How's that? God asked proudly. Shaniqua was not impressed. Blue, green, and brown. Is that the best you can come up with? God sighed, looked out at the world again. Shaniqua was right. Everything still looked drab. What was he going to do? The next morning, God woke up with an idea, but he wasn't sure it would work. He skipped breakfast and headed toward the edge of heaven. What's up, mighty maker? Bruce asked, flying alongside God. You'll see. Where's Shaniqua? Right behind you, God. The angels sensed something big was going to happen. By the time God arrived, they were sitting on the clouds, waiting. They had brought picnic baskets and coolers filled with lemonade, and they were eager to see what God was going to do. God stepped to the edge, cleared his throat, and out came the most beautiful sound the angels had ever heard. "What's that?" Shaniqua wanted to know. "Why, that's music," Bruce exclaimed. He had been reading about it in the library of everything that is going to be. "That's music," he repeated in wonder. God's singing was like a choir of 6 million voices, high voices, low voices, voices singing notes only dogs heard, and voices singing notes only the whales in the deepest part of the ocean heard. As the notes came out of God's mouth, they took shape and became circles, squares, spirals, trapezoids, rhombuses, triangles. The shape notes floated through space and down to the earth, and when they touched the ground, they turned into colors. Reds and blues and purples and yellows and pinks. "What's all them colors?" an angel asked Bruce and pointed down at the earth. Bruce shook his head slowly in amazement. "Those are flowers." "Flowers," the angels repeated in hushed whisper. "Flowers." Shaniqua couldn't believe what she was hearing and seeing. "Go on with your bad self, God," she laughed with delight. As the notes sprinkled to the ground, they bloomed, and each said its name, and the names were like music. Daffodil, sunflower, chicory, amaranth, those are all flower names. "Let me hear you say that." "Amaranth, that's almost as pretty as God singing it, ain't it?" "Chamomile, gardenia, baby's breath." Close to evening, God stopped, and he looked at Shaniqua. "Give me 5, she said, holding her hand out to his. She slapped it hard. "You are truly cool, God. Truly." That night when God went to sleep, he slept soundly. Finally, he was done with creating the world. The next morning, God didn't have one eye open before he heard whispering. "It's lonely down here." It was the flowers. "I know we were put here to make the world beautiful, but we're lonely." God couldn't believe his ears. Maybe creating a world had been a big mistake. He was probably going to be hearing nothing but complaints from now on. "Bruce!" God called in a voice so loud that all of heaven shook. Well, Bruce had just been trying to explain to his wife why he hadn't brought her any flowers yesterday when he heard God's voice. "Oops! Gotta go," said Bruce. "Himself is not in a good mood today. Don't wait for me to eat dinner." He put on his wings and was out the window. When Bruce reached God's house, the Almighty was sitting on the porch drinking coffee with his wife, Irene God. Bruce had always wondered what God's first name was, but he had never had the nerve to ask. Irene God. "Good morning, terrific Titan." "Ain't nothing good about it," said God. "What's the problem?" said Bruce. "It's them flowers I made yesterday." "They're lonely," said God. "Well, sing something into creation to keep them company," Bruce said, and underneath his breath he added, "George." "My voice is hoarse from all that singing I did yesterday," said God. "And what did you just call me?" God asked, getting angry. Nothing, fearless fixer, nothing," said Bruce. "This is not the morning to mess with me," said God. "Yes, sir," said Bruce. "Where is Shaniqua?" said God. "Oh, she liked your singing so much that she's at home trying to teach herself how to sing," said Bruce. "How does she sound?" said God. "Well, to tell you the truth, almost as good as you." God smiled. Go get her. I want to hear that for myself. A few minutes later, Bruce returned with Shaniqua. She had never been to God's house or met his wife, and she was as proper as a little girl playing grown-up. Bruce says you can sing almost as good as me, God said. Shaniqua blushed and shook her head. No, sir, I'd just be singing around the house, that's all, singing to myself, really, said Shaniqua. Well, let me hear you, said God. Shaniqua opened her mouth, and the sound that came from her throat was as soft, as smooth as flower's breath, as quiet as it was. It could be heard all over heaven. The angels stopped what they were doing to listen. The sound was so beautiful that water began to flow from their eyes, and that is how tears came into creation. The music went out into the universe. The stars and the planets had never heard anything so beautiful. Tiny pieces started to fall off them. These were their tears. The pieces floated down through space until they reached Earth. People looked at the tiny scraps fluttering all around them. The yellow ones were the sun's tears. The blue ones were the tears from the moon. The white ones were the stars' tears, while the red ones were from Mars and the orange ones from Venus. What are they? People wanted to know. Flutterbys, someone called them. The air was filled with flashing colors as the flutterbys flew, here, there, visiting and kissing each other. Look what you done, God said to Shaniqua. You created flutterbys. Wrong, said Bruce. That silly word is never going to exist. Well, what are they? God wanted to know. Shaniqua smiled. I know. The people are a little confused. What they mean to say is butterflies. Ain't that pretty, Irene? Mrs. God agreed that it was, and so did God, and so did the people on earth. And they all held out their arms, and the butterflies covered them and their entire bodies. And each person was wearing a suit of butterflies. Give me 5, Shaniqua said to God. He shook his head. I couldn't have made the world without you, Shaniqua. And God gave her a big hug. What a truly cool world, God. Truly. The end. Well, I hope you enjoyed the reading of What a Truly Cool World. And we're going to use this as our story, try to make up a little song about it. Thanks for listening.